Okay, well, I think I'm going to kick things off. Welcome to Poets and Writers, another edition of Poets and Writers California Town Hall. My name is Jamie Asaye FitzGerald, and I direct Poets and Writers California office and our Readings and Workshops West program. And I'm here today with my colleague, Jalen Lisbon, up in the top corner there, depending on your view. And Jalen is joining us from New York City. He is our Programs and Partnerships Assistant and will be helping with the Zoom and helping us to moderate our question and answer and discussion period. I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that we operate on the traditional lands of the Tongva, Tataviam, and Chumash, and the Lenape, Rockaway, and Canarsie, the original stewards of the land we now call Los Angeles and New York City. And then I'd like to briefly introduce the organization presenting this event, Poets and Writers. We have been presenting community building events like check-ins and roundtable meetings and town halls like this one for over 20 years. We have been doing these events as they help us to connect with the literary community, the writers and literary presenters that we work with in many different ways. Our mission is to foster the professional development of poets and writers, to promote communication throughout the literary community, and to help create an environment in which literature can be appreciated by the widest possible public. And so our community building events help us do those things. They go hand in hand with our mini grants program. This is a program we've been running since the very beginning with the organization's founding in 1970. The Readings and Workshops program funds literary events throughout the state of California, also in New York State and in 8 cities outside of these states. We'd like to thank the California Arts Council for its support of our program here in California. And I will talk more about the Readings and Workshops program at the end of the event. So if any of you have any questions about it, you can save it for then. We'll begin with our guest speaker, Orange County Poet Laureate, Dr. Natalie J. Graham, followed by questions and discussion. And at the end, hopefully we'll have time for the folks here in attendance, many of you writers and literary presenters yourselves, to share any events or projects that you have coming up, or resources that you'd like to share, such as calls for submissions, opportunities, reading series, spots, that kind of thing. So I hope we'll have time to do that at the end of the event. Jalen is going to share our agenda in the chat. This will include lots of links to resources that Poets and Writers offers, as well as our speaker's bio. But I am going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker today. Somebody who has applied for Readings and Workshops funding for events they've presented, and somebody that I believe has been funded by Poets and Writers as well as a writer. Dr. Natalie J. Graham is an award-winning author and performer who has toured nationally with her collection of poems, Begin with a Failed Body. In August 2021, she was appointed Poet Laureate of Orange County. Natalie is also Professor of African American Studies and the Director of the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation at Cal State University Fullerton. This institute works to create initiatives that support cooperative economics, artistic development, and community-based research in Orange County. She co-owns KayJo Creatives, an event planning and production company that aims to elevate expression, empower education, and energize engagement. When she isn't making poems, teaching, or planning events, she loves perfecting her chocolate chip cookie baking skills and learning about science with her son, Ronald. Natalie will speak about how her writing has opened pathways to her work at all the places just mentioned. And I want to welcome Dr. Natalie J. Graham. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that introduction. Thank you to Poets and Writers, to all of the folks here and community with us and sharing this space together. I'm excited to think about talk about poetry and how writing really does allow us pathways into other things. I think for me, writing has always been, and especially poetry, has always been part of my work as a professor, sort of my intellectual and my creative, my research and my creative sides weren't really separate from me. I think a lot of times in the academy that sort of immediately becomes creativity is like siloed to a very particular department in a very particular space. And I think I'm grateful for the fact that that's always been something that's been with me throughout my journey. When I started, I a lot, like as a lot of folks do, I kind of started thinking like the MFA was the path to do writing, so I got my MFA right after my undergraduate degree. And I felt after I had this English and anthropology degree, and then I got a master's in fine arts. And I was like, I think I'm less employable now with a master's degree in fine arts than I was before, because there really wasn't a pathway. I really didn't know what to do about the fact that I just had spent 2 years writing poems, and it was hard for me to translate. And this was kind of early where I think a lot of folks felt that if you just did the work, then you could just kind of follow that path as a writer. And it didn't work for me. And so what I ended up doing is getting my PhD in American Studies, because I was really excited about the conversations that weren't being had in literature because of separation around race and ethnicity, right? And we still do that a lot. We still kind of separate folks in different categories, and we often talk about them in different categories, even when their work heavily influence each other. And so I was really excited about this conversation. I thought would have been really interesting between Walt Whitman and Langston Hughes. They felt like two poets who really had a lot in common. Hughes was speaking back to Whitman. They were really interested in the same sort of everyday elevation of the common man. And so I didn't end up pursuing that exercise. But what I did do is really think a lot about how poetry and rhetoric shows up throughout different spaces, and maybe in spaces that we don't expect it. So I ended up studying Lil Wayne, who's a rapper from New Orleans, and I studied the way that his work was in dialogue with identity and performance, and the way that he kind of used language and literacy to create a space around himself to cross over into a mainstream space. And what does it mean for artists to cross over? What do they have to do that practice? And so it was always threaded through the work that I was doing, thinking about the way that we create stories about ourselves and how those stories about ourselves help us navigate the world, and how we often have to dismantle larger narratives in the world that kind of might be in opposition to what we feel is true about ourselves and what we feel is true about people around us. So this idea of narrative, this idea of storytelling, this way that I think storytelling and narrative is embedded in how we move through the world in every single space, is one of the things that I'm continually going back to. And I'm continually hearing in different poets and writers spaces like engineering. They're like, how do we create a narrative about engineering that is inclusive to all folks? Or how do we think differently about sociology? All of these things really, I think at some real core level, is about storytelling and narrative making. And so I think that that's one of the things that I keep seeing again as really the key opening point to different spaces and different opportunities for me. And so I started at Cal State Fullerton about 10 years ago, as Jamie mentioned, in the African American Studies department. And throughout my time there, I think one of the things that I always did that led me in some of the places that I am right now is I was always really interested in creating space for other poets to share their work. And so I think that every year I, partnered with folks in the English department, folks in the library, not just to have workshops and share, my knowledge and my poetry, but also to create a platform for other poets to speak. And so we got a chance to have Patricia Smith and Doug Brown and Lynn Thompson. Lots of poets came through that space and were able to share their work with students. And I think we were able to also, throughout that whole time, I was always bringing in other classes. I was trying to connect with American Studies, trying to connect with Chicano Studies, or with English departments, people who are outside of my, African American Studies department, in order for them to recognize that there is a through line here, that when we bring in something like poetry, we bring in something like writing and narrative, we're able to create these connections among and between each other. And so that was really the first 5 or 6 years I was at Cal State Fullerton. I wasn't focusing on doing a whole lot of writing myself. I kind of had put poetry to the side a bit, and I was just enjoying it. It was really something that I wasn't super involved in doing. I love teaching. I love creating the spaces for other poets to connect. And when I, have talked to my thesis advisor, he was like, maybe you should just send out these poems. You have a bunch of poems you haven't really done a whole lot with. And I think like a lot of us, like we have a lot of work that we're not sending out, we're not maybe doing a whole lot with. And I think that and that selection of poems were the poems that won the Cave Canem First Book Prize. And so I think for me, that was really the moment of shift where I was like, oh, I think there's something about the work that I'm doing, the work that I'm kind of bringing in, that I'm taking in, and that I'm creating, that has an audience in a community that's already there that I don't see. And so I think the first part of what I really, have continued to see and built on is this idea of narrative that I spoke about. And the second part of what I'm really always excited about and thinking about is the community that's around your work. It's like there's a community of ready listeners, ready readers to be in conversation with you about the work that you have. And so that's something that I also took away from being selected, but then also the year or two after, 2017, 2018, 2019, when I toured with the book, that was a confirmation. It was a confirmation that as much as we are, I'm a lover of craft. I love language. I love literature. I love poetry. I love writing and reading. It just speaks back to what, is the purpose of poets and writers, the first line, to foster community and strengthen connections. Like at the end of the day, yes, we're here to do the writing. Yes, we're here to, think about ways to create opportunities for ourselves and others. And for me as a poet, all of that craft work, all of the, workshops, all of the thinking through the sonnet, how can I reinvigorate that? All of these things, the end of that, the purpose of that, the larger mission, values, and goals for me is always going to be community and conversation. And I think that poetry has become more and more a vehicle for me to see the ways to connect and to give me opportunity and an excuse to talk to people who I otherwise wouldn't talk to or wouldn't be in conversation with. And I think just that alone is kind of a driving force for me that I think I'm going to always return to in my work and always return to in the ways that I see my writing and the purpose of my writing, even though I really don't think a lot about audience. I think it's really important as a writer for me. I don't think about an audience. I don't think who's going to read this? What are they going to say? That's not something that's a preoccupation of mine. I really want to think about, the work and the story first. But in doing that, I'm so grateful for the opportunity that it has all the time, touched back and created this opportunity for community. And so as I was developing, the first kind of part of my story that was mentioned is this this business KayJo Creatives that I started with one of my friends, Kia Vance, who's a screenwriter. one of the things that we were really interested in is how do we engage people where they are in the process of creation? How do we like create opportunities for them to see themselves as creators already, right? We often think like you need some skills, you need some, pre-work before you start the work. And I think that that's the thing that we brought to our events. So we did a lot of work in San Bernardino and throughout that county, throughout the IE. We had poetry, we had painting, we had we kind of started with a poetry brunch where we brought in different folks to read and to share their work together. We had all the participants write a poem. We had great food. So that was kind of like, our inaugural event when we started, but always thinking about ways to invite people into conversation and community and to see themselves as writers already, see themselves as people who are already communicating, and to use writing as a medium to communicate in a different way. So we got the opportunity to do that. And one of the things that we did, Jamie had mentioned the grant that we got during COVID, I put on a workshop with another colleague of mine who's a poet as well, Cynthia Briano. She lives in LA. We did a revision workshop. So we did a virtual revision workshop because we felt like there's a lot of writing workshops and we have the opportunity to get the first draft out, but we didn't see as many revision workshops where we thought about like, what are some processes of revision? Like, what are the tenets of revision? What are the 9 strategies of revision? So we kind of created that curriculum around thinking through the revision process. How was revision a metaphor? Like all of those things, and working through folks' first drafts of things or second drafts of things or things that they were stuck on. So we really, we had that workshop was called Writing Forward, Crafting Revision. And so we had that was a great community, kind of going back to this idea of creating community through this workshop experience. We had the opportunity to do that as well. The other thing that was mentioned is my work with Segerstrom Center for the Arts. And at Segerstrom, it's a performing arts center, if you're not familiar with it. It's a large, in Orange County, it's kind of like, I kind of describe it as like the place you go to watch Broadway in Orange County. Like if you want to see a Broadway show, if you want to see international dance, if you want to see, you're going to go to Segerstrom Center eventually. You're going to find your way there. And so that's, I actually was invited to curate an event for them. And really it came out of this idea of the work that I had done, making events around poets, bringing poets together, bringing these, events together. And that was the way the current director had found me and sort of reached out and said, oh, can you create a narrative for us? Can you think about like what it could look like as a whole program? We can reach out to bands, we can reach out to vendors, but we don't have a story to tell about this program. And so they reached out to me to create a narrative that kind of tied together a series of poets and speakers and musicians. And there was a paint party. We, thought about this idea of it was actually their first Juneteenth event. So in 2021, I think they had their first Juneteenth event. And we celebrated the concept of freedom in bloom. Like, what does it mean to have a seed of freedom? So we had real seeds, we had pots, we had soil, we had a writing activity, we had a painting activity. So all of it kind of tied together. And the idea was to think about how can we do things that aren't just writing, but we're telling a story over the course of time. So it was about a 4-hour event. And every 30 or 45 minutes, participants were doing something different to think through these concepts of freedom, think through what it means to be free, what it means to kind of express that and enjoy that and fight for that, right? It's not something that that is guaranteed, and it's certainly not experienced in equal ways across all folks. And so that was really what created, we're talking about creating pathways. It's what kind of created a pathway to Segerstrom, thinking about storytelling and narrative and how we can offer these narratives that are thoughtful and meaningful to organizations that are already centered in the arts. Like I wasn't a producer at that time. I wasn't like bringing together, the stage directions or setup, but what they needed was something before that. They needed an idea of what to put in the places, and then they can kind of come alongside and do the work with me. And so, through that and through other conversations, I actually ended up applying for the vice president position of community engagement at Segerstrom. And I was in that position for the better part of last year, from January to August. And so that, that role wasn't a great fit for me. So I went back to being a consultant for them, and to do this sort of just specific role of thinking about narrative, thinking about story, and thinking about how they can work through these concepts in whatever the program is, right? Or how do we tie together different elements of a program to create an experience that's not just a one-time experience for folks who are going to the venue. So that was really the way that poetry, the way that writing, the way that narrative guided me to that experience. And then most recently, I founded or co-founded the Institute of Black Intellectual Innovation. And honestly, I think that I keep underlying this idea of narrative and story, but it really is it was a very similar experience. It was the experience of being a Black woman in Orange County. Orange County is a place that does not have a history of racial inclusion. Like, that is not Orange County's history. We can't get in a lot of ways, there's a lot of contemporary residue and resonance of that. So like, what will it take for folks who live here to really feel like they belong here and feel like they're part of here? And that's something that requires great imagination. And as somebody who I'm a faculty member at Cal State Fullerton, I tell people all the time, like, what if people felt like Cal State Fullerton was the best university for any, folks to attend, any Black folks to attend in Southern California? Because we had gone out of our way to really lean into what it means to belong in a space, what it means to be welcome in a space, and just to acknowledge that everyone doesn't feel that in the same way. And that feeling is not just individual, it's tied to historical legacies. So that was really what the Institute was concerned with, thinking about what is the narrative, where does that come from, and how can we use data and experience and art and community building to change that narrative, to see ourselves as part of the same community, to be really intentional about institutional belonging and creating space where people don't have to fight to feel like they're part of it. And so that was really what the Institute does. And we do a lot of work with poets and writers broadly. Like, one of the things that I'm always really interested in our programming is making sure that we have a creative element at all times. So we do have, for instance, we have Black Book Chat, which meets every second Saturday at 10 a.m. And so that event allows us to chat about a book by a Black author. But a lot of times, it's such a wide variety of books that we get an opportunity to, we don't just talk about books that are kind of very specifically about identity and representation. We talk about books like tomorrow or Saturday, we're actually reading and chatting about Tyehimba Jess's Olio, which is, a Pulitzer Prize winning. Clearly, the book is about race in some very specific ways, but it's also, I just kind of posted about it today. It's a masterclass. It's a masterclass in pushing the bounds of poetry. What can poetry do? How does poetry engage with history? How can we use poetry to understand something? We can understand a fact by creating a poem around it. To me, that's a really deep and powerful job, obligation, opportunity that poetry has, that writing has, that it can take something that we all agree upon and know is true, and that can teach us something bigger about that moment, about that fact. And so I really love that Olio does that work. And so, in our Black Book Chat, we try to always encourage folks that they don't have to have read the book to engage, and we'll read part of the book. We'll talk about the author, we'll talk about the ideas. And so for me, that's a really important work to do, to create opportunities for folks who feel uncomfortable talking about race, who feel uncomfortable talking about poetry, who feel uncomfortable talking about literature, to just sit and listen. So much of Black Book Chat is just folks just listening in and kind of learning a little bit more about literature and about writing and about all of the ways that writing touches our lives and reflects upon our lives. And so we do that on a monthly basis. September 9th will be our first in-person event. for a Black Book Chat, and that will allow us to celebrate 3 years of these monthly meetings, these monthly book chats, and we'll do that at Cal State Fullerton's campus. And so really excited about the ways that we can move from the virtual space to the in-person space, hybrid space, that we're having all of these kind of back and forth, and then throughout the whole thing, we're able to continue to develop and build community around words and around language, and really use language to create the world we want. I mean, that's so much of what I think is the work of narrative and the work of like thoughtful, critical thinking around the work that we're doing, right? Like creating a beautiful place to be. And so those are some of the ways that I feel like poetry has created a path for me, some of the work that I'm doing. And in my role as Poet Laureate of Orange County, one of the things that I've really tried to do is write occasional poems, write poems that are in response to a particular moment or a particular artist or author. And I did write a poem for Citric Acid, which is a new journal, a new online journal in Orange County. And I had these kind of to finish up my Poet Laureateship term, I guess, I'm gonna write a series of, I'm gonna call them something like sonnets. I haven't quite figured out, like right now it's mainly just the lines number, but I think I'm gonna shape them a little bit more and think through some of the rhythm and rhyme and meter of the works, but I'll read that for us, that'll be my last thing. And it's called What's Love? And it's a poem for Tina Turner. And so the series that I'm writing is a series of 12 poems about female musicians who are sometimes just seen as like pop stars or rock stars, but they really are iconic for a reason. And so I kind of picked those 12. What's love for Tina? They speak of her body, her muscular and majestic legs, her dance across the stage as a curve of water cutting down a mountain, or dewy forest air vibrating and glistening with morning, or a thudding heart pulsing slick and electric. The heart, the fist end of a boxing glove, muscle woven over muscle, each stratum complex, this one patterned with curved and swirled ridges, a figure-8 flourish of fibrous ribbon, that one smooth as grape skin. This is the heart we have, flexing open, flexing close, the shuddering pulse, messy and persistent. Our bodies, rivers, thrum rhythms we can't hear. Love's too thin to hold us, dear. Of course, the heart has 3 layers. Of course, it's a muscle working all day, all night, in the dark. I have her voice close to me. I heard her say, "We never do anything easy." Thank you.
I'm looking for my reaction so I can clap. Yay. Thank you so much, Natalie. That was a beautiful poem. And you said so many things that I couldn't write fast enough to get them down so that I remember. But thankfully, we're recording this. So I can go back and listen again. But I wanted to open things up to our audience, our attendees, our fellow writers. If you have questions or reactions to anything Natalie was talking about, please share. Feel free to unmute. Chris.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Graham. It was just, there was so much there. What Jamie was saying, I was feeling the same way. I just can't write fast enough. There's so many things I want to remember. One thing you talked about, two parts that you talked about, and you said we can understand one thing that you had talked about, we can understand a fact by creating a poem around it. And then at another time you're talking about bringing in history and about Orange County and its history of not being inclusive to race. And it made me think of Clint Smith's book, How the Word is Passed, and how he talks about place and used place as a way to study experience and history and resonance, a word you use that I love. And I wonder if there are places in California, maybe Orange County, maybe Southern California more specifically, or Orange County more specifically, that would be places with a kind of resonance that one might look at as opportunities to wrap a poem around.
I love that question. I think that, like, for me, like, so many of my poems are grief, are poems of grief, like a meditation of grief around. And so I think that, like, there's no good place, right? There's no place that I'm like, ooh, like it's not like, that there's like a happy place and I want to write about that, or a sad place, you're just drawn to a thing, and some things are just so interesting. There was this, the thing, and I'm born and raised in Florida. So I think that I have a very different sense of place, and like history, right? And legacy. And so I think for me, I'm so used to like history being like embedded in the ground, like it's all the way down, right? In California, it feels like all the topsoil is like constantly being turned over, right? Like there's so you drill 3 units down and there's nothing there, and so I think that in a lot of ways, I think about that, like the absence of who was there before, and how completely it feels like people are sort of erased from areas. In Orange County in particular, if you know anything about Santa Ana is considered right now a very, Latinx dominant space. But, in the 60s, there were these Black neighborhoods like Little Texas and the Square and all this, and then like there, these things like, same thing with South Central, like there's these places that have these very specific like racial ties, but then because of so many things, folks get moved in one direction or another. And so I'm really kind of fascinated by the way that it feels like hard to hold on to place in California in a different way than it feels like in places where I'm more familiar with, or places that I call home. So that idea to me is something where I'm always sort of thinking about, like, and I think a lot about ghosts. I think a lot about like, not like, the ghosts of time and place, and like who's like hovering, whose echoes are here, and so that's something that's always really interesting to me. So I don't know that there's one place or another that's better, but I'm always interested in stories when it feels like a whole thing was carried out and then erased. I think that that's kind of always like striking to me. How can we recover those stories and remember who was there before?
Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. I also feel like too that sometimes the place wraps itself around the poem. It's like the opposite. It's like wherever you go, if you're writing about grief, the place you're in wraps itself around that grief. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Do we have anything in the chat?
Yes, we have a lot of kind words and also just thoughts in the chat, along with a few questions. We have one from Sarah Taylor asking, what does allyship in poetry look like / sound like for you, Dr. Graham?
That's a good question. When I think about Allyship is interesting because I feel like it's one of those words that kind of lost a little bit of its power because of overuse. I think in general, allyship is walking alongside knowing someone well enough to walk alongside them or walk before them into rooms, to bring them into rooms where they aren't otherwise being thought about, to advocate for people when they're not around. And so in poetry, I think it's a lot of the work that many of us are doing here, like creating space for other writers to always be part of the conversation. One thing I typically do in my readings, if I ever have more than like 2 minutes to read a poem, or I'm ever allowed to read more than one poem, like I always read another poet's poem before mine. And when I think about like allyship, it's like how many readings have, I know some of folks are maybe not poets or maybe, enter the space another way, but I think about the fact that at every reading, you're also going to get a poem by, Tracy K. Smith or by, another author, if you come to a reading of mine. And that's always been really important to me. It's always been important to me to read a woman in those spaces, because there's still such a lopsided publishing and readership. So when I think of allyship, I think about that sort of like intentional work that I would do. But I also think in general, like we all need to be better allies of poetry broadly as critics. I don't think we write enough about poetry. I think that there's a lot more poetry than there is like, deep, rich, interesting, engaging writing about poetry. And so I would love to see more of that, more writing about poetry that's like more blogs about poetry, more posting about poetry, like those things I think are all great ways to create communities.
Thank you so much. I feel inspired by that. Were there any other questions, Jalen, in the chat?
Yes, we have another question from Sonia, asking, who are some writers and creatives that have influenced your scholarship and poetic craft?
That's it. Thank you for that question. I think like it's always nice to be able to talk about your icons, the folks you love. I mentioned, my dissertation was on Lil Wayne and rap music. So rap music has heavily influenced the way that I think about writing. And so to that end, like I would say Kendrick Lamar is one of my favorite artists across any genre or mode. I think that another person who I feel similarly about is Patricia Smith. I think that her ability to move between like what we typically separate as stage poet and page poet is just, again, like Olio elevated the craft, elevated the discussion, helped us think differently about what we can do and what can be. And then I think about, I mentioned her earlier, but I think about Lynn Thompson, like Poet Laureate of LA County, in the way that she's a phenomenal poet, right? But she's also one of the most generous folks to support other poets that I've ever met. And so as much as we can, like continuing to be generous in our time and our uplifting of others and reaching out and being in conversation with, like all of those things, she's been like a huge model for me of like the way that you can be really gracious in ways and in spaces when you don't have to. I think you get to a certain level and there's a lot of poets who have a lot of ego, and I think like I always tell my sister is like yeah, poet, like, but the most famous poet is like totally unknown to everyone else in the world. Like you're not, most people aren't even, it's not like you're talking about Beyonce, like, so I think like, it's kind of like, yeah, let's, check the ego and, the fame, it's hard to do that. But Lynn is one of the people who just inspires me to be just gracious, just like deeply gracious and humble around every opportunity to build up other poets and to create space for poets.
Janae?
Thanks, Jamie. Thank you so much for this. This has been a really, really wonderful talk. I teach creative writing and composition at the community college level. And one of the things I've noticed, not just from my students, but also my colleagues, is that so many people have had really bad experiences with poetry, going back to like elementary school, and their idea of what poetry is really not representative of what poetry is right now and all that poetry can do. And, you know, as a poet, I completely agree with this idea that poetry is a way to create community, right? It can bring people together. So I guess my question is, how do we get people to engage with poetry, contemporary poetry that's so relevant to everything that's going on right now?
It's a hard question, right? Like, I think like, the first thing I thought of is feed them. Like, you have to feed them. Like, I think like, you know, but there's something about, weaving poetry into whatever else is happening, right? Very few people are going to sign up for a poetry class if they've had a bad experience. Or really, all my students are afraid of poems. They're all terrified of poems. They're like, I can't write a poem. I'd rather write 10-page essay than write 1-page poem. You know, like, I think like, but I think it's really great if we have like, before every kind of speech, we have a poem. Before we, you know, in our science classes, we think about like, I think if there's a way to weave poetry into other aspects of our lives more organically, we kind of teach ourselves the value and teach each other the value. One thing I talk a lot about, my mom is an inspiration in poetry, and I've talked about that a lot of times before. But she would write poems for birthday gifts. And so this idea of saying that a poem is something that we use, a poem is something that we can like make and give to someone, I think maybe will help. You know, I think that if we have to make it too practical, then we might like miss, you know, the one of its values, like, is that it kind of stops us and like reminds us that we're not just producers. But I do think that like, also the idea of slowing down and writing something to someone, because really it's like when you lose like writing, like it's not just the poetry, you know, it's also like the critical thinking and writing. If you can't write, you can't think, you know. It's like thinking about what's the process that's happening when we're writing, like what is our brain doing? How are we thinking differently? How are we creating ideas that we didn't have before? So maybe I think really helping to see the value in the process, and getting away from the idea of like, this is what a good poem looks like, you know, and having people also see poetry in their everyday lives. Like, I talk about rap a lot because I think like rappers are our last like rhymed poets that are really like, you know, sticking to the rhyme, sticking to this, you know, rhyme and meter, you know. And so I think like we really have a lot of opportunities, and hopefully more so. I feel like there's kind of a little bit of a rising tide around poetry being more popular. There's kind of poets, you know, on Instagram, and lots of poets have kind of gotten a lot of popularity recently. But I think like figuring out how to help them see the value in the process and think of poetry as an offering, not just for themselves or their teacher, but for someone else that they love, you know, so they're kind of putting that love into it.
Yes, that's beautiful. It made me think of the inauguration and Amanda Gorman. What a sensation, you know, she caused with her amazing poem and her youth and her beauty, all those things, you know. But to show that poetry can be woven into everyday life is, I think, one way, you know, of letting people know that it can be part of your everyday life. I actually have the practice of kind of took up the practice of writing haiku during the pandemic, so that I could sort of just have this everyday experience of poetry during isolation. Are there any other questions? I want to make sure we don't miss anything. Jalen, is our chat clear? Do we get to everyone in there?
Yeah, our chat looks clear.
Okay,
Questions?
wonderful. Well, I just want to thank you, Natalie, Dr. Graham, for joining us and sharing about your work and the pathways it's led you through, for reading your wonderful poem and for answering all of our questions. I greatly appreciate your time and energy. And I did want to open it up now. This is the kind of community sharing portion of the event. Dr. Graham does have to step away for a book launch event coming up. So just want to say thank you so much. And we'll be sending out a roster of everyone who was here and the recording once that is ready. So thank you so much and enjoy your book launch event.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Take care. So now we have a few moments left to open things up and do our own little check-in with each other. This is a great moment to just introduce yourself briefly and let us know if you have any projects that you'd like to share, readings coming up or workshops and that kind of thing. And I will call on Janae.
Hi, I'm Janae Daniello, and I do have a reading coming up on May 21st, which is a Sunday. It's on Zoom, and it's with Sundress Publications. They do a Poets in Pajamas series. We will not actually be wearing pajamas. I'm sorry to disappoint you. But I will be reading with another really terrific poet named Athena Nassar. And it'll be 15 minutes each, and then we'll do a Q&A. So Sunday, 4 o'clock on Zoom, May 21st.
Great. Do you have a link you can share with us?
Yeah, I can drop that in the chat.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you so much. And you've also been teaching workshops, right?
Yeah.
Community workshops?
I am, but I'm doing, right now I'm doing them only for cancer patients and survivors. So
Okay.
yeah, I was doing them with, opening them up to everyone, but right now I'm just doing them for that group.
Okay. I hope that you'll think about the readings and workshops program funding. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but our next fiscal year is coming up July 1st, and we're accepting applications for writing workshops and readings from organizations, sponsoring organizers. So keep that in mind. Any other event announcements? Yes, Kevin.
Well, I'd like to thank Poets and Writers again for helping to sponsor the 40th anniversary San Luis Obispo Poetry Festival we just had. And we have been getting Poets and Writers grants since 1994, I believe. So we've been taking advantage of your kind offerings for quite a while, and so we hopefully will do some more events. I'm in the process of more like a month, bi-monthly, or with the Royal Grandy Library, where the last event was of our 40th anniversary. So yeah, well, we're thankful for the Poets and Writers matching grants for the program, without a doubt.
And congratulations on 40 years of presenting the San Luis Obispo Poetry Festival. It's really amazing track record.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, over that 40 years, we've worked with the city promotional coordinating committee, with California Arts Council, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, you know, private donors, of course, and you know, and a lot of different venues, you know. So we've been very fortunate to keep this thing going for this long, man.
Fantastic. Larry.
Hi, Jamie.
Hi.
Hey, I had a question. Once again, I'm in the same vein. Thank you. I've been there. I think it's 28 years you guys have been funding me around the country here. So
Oh.
pretty cool. Yeah. You're not getting the money back. But because I'm kind of off the beaten track with cowboy poetry, and I listen to these, and it's wonderful that people are out there doing poetry, but I'm a little curious. I hear about somebody says we come and do a poem. I mean, when I go somewhere, I do an hour and a half program, all poetry. And I'm just curious as to, with these programs that I hear, like in Orange County and that sort of stuff too. Number one, are people getting paid to do this? And are they, what do the people who are putting on these events, or the poets, what do they expect of the poets? I mean, do they want them to come and just do one poem and say, thank you very much, it was very nice, and go, or whatever? And I'll just open it up to the group, what their reactions are.
Well,
Yeah, would anybody like to respond?
well, I can tell you as a producer of a festival for 40 years that, you know, my poets come and read for anywhere from 45 minutes to 20 minutes, and I'll have multiple poets at an event with an open reading as well. And the open reading segment, I always believe to be a very important part of the presentation, because it helps people, you know, have a voice, maybe starting out poets or whatever, read with established poets. And that's another thing I've done also with inviting poets of a national stature or whatever to read with local poets, you know. So, but yeah, I'm sure you must be getting paid. You said you've been working with poets and writers for 28 years.
Yeah, I don't go anywhere for free.
You haven't been getting funded?
Huh?
You have been getting funded, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, then, so you're getting paid at your events? No.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And where do you live?
I live in Reno.
Oh, Reno. All right.
But I travel, you know, my year is pretty much out of a suitcase most of the time. But yeah, we do. But my thing, and it was interesting to listen to the speaker, was the fact that my job as a cowboy poet is to take my poetry to people who have never heard before. You know, I'm really good about, you know, going to the biker nuns club and do cowboy poetry for them. And I always ask the audience, you know, who here has never been victimized by cowboy poetry? And usually those are the people that I'm after. Most of the time, once you connect with those people, they go, wow, that was pretty cool. So the next event coming up, whether it be me or someone else, hopefully that creates a continuing audience and keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. And also to introduce poets and writers to that organization, so that they don't, it's not just they're helping to fund me, but they're also, hey, think about poets and writers the next time you do this event. And hopefully the whole thing spiders out. But
I must admit, I never actually scheduled a cowboy poet.
Well, now's your chance,
to read at one of my events. It's a totally different
always looking
venue.
for a
I mean,
gig, man.
I don't. That's the way I feel.
Yeah, no, I love doing oddball events, and because all of a sudden the cowboy shows up, and she was talking about, I teach poetry to middle school kids. I've been doing that for 30 years, and I do programs all over the country, and I use a lot of rap, hip hop music for it because it's something that they know. And rhyming poetry is, that's hip hop music is nothing more than good rhyming poetry, and if they're good, and I use a lot of the older guys like Run DMC and all those guys because they were good. They were really good. And so the kids get that. They get the beat, they get rhythm, they get meter, they get rhyme, they get meter, and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, I'm just curious as to what people are doing with their poetry. If you're going to do small little coffee shops, or if there's hopefully there are, like Evan has, hopefully there are large events where you're seeing a lot of people. And we just did an event last week. We did, 700 people in 2 days.
Wow.
So that sends people out. That sends people out going, wow, poetry. I'm not, I always said poetry will clear a room faster than a politician with a cause. And just, you got to be really careful with it. And that word itself, we try to minimize that word, but once people come and see the entertainment value of it, and there's always a message. Poetry is moralistic, and so there's always a message to it. So, and I'm just curious. I listen to people about what they're doing with their poetry, where it's taking them, and where it's taking the audience.
Yeah. Well, there's all kinds of events from small, reading series, coffee shop events, open mics, to larger festivals, literary festivals. There was just one here in Northeast LA, Lit Fest in the Dina, and there were, I don't know, probably about 30 different panel discussions, all with 4 or 5 different writers, and not just poets, but fiction writers, creative nonfiction writers. So there's wide variety of events that writers are doing,
Right.
and teaching community workshops and in schools and all that kind of thing. Any other announcements from the group?
We have talking about events on June 17th in celebration of Juneteenth. We're going to have a reading at the Fairmont Park in Riverside for an anthology release that I edited called These Black Bodies Are. So I don't have the exact time yet. We're still nailing things down, but when I do, I'll put it on the list.
Thank you. The lit list?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Great. And hi, Romaine.
Hi.
Our next town hall is going to be a little ways away, but it was when I could get Lee Herrick, our current California Poet Laureate, on the schedule. So I hope that you'll save the date. Oh, where is it? I think it's September 21st, but I will confirm that when I send the roster.
I just saw him in the library in San Francisco.
Oh yeah.
He was in a reading there.
And I'm also going to be doing a workshop leaders retreat sometime in the summer. So stay tuned for that. If you got the announcement for this, you'll get the announcement for that as well. And I hope those of you who teach creative writing workshops will consider joining us for that event. And then last but not least, I just wanted to remind you all, for those of you who apply for readings and workshops funding, that our new fiscal year begins July 1st. We're out of money now for events before then, but we will be starting the new cycle for July 1st and on. So if you are participating in a reading or teaching a creative writing workshop or presenting one, feel free to ask me questions, get in touch and let me know, and I will help you apply for the funding that we have for writers. And these these small grants, they go directly to the writer. A few of you here, Susan and Larry, and Romaine, and I think Janae have gotten our grants, I think, as writers, not yet, okay. And they're very, very easy to apply for. It's not a complicated process. The organizer just has to fill out an online application with the event information. And it's mostly first come, first serve program, although we do have some priorities that we keep in mind. You know, we definitely prioritize workshops for underserved populations, for rural areas. In fact, we have a sort of a offshoot of the program called the Rural Libraries Tour, where we send writers like Larry and Susan who live closer to areas that are less, you know, populous, there's less, you know, activity going on in the arts. We send them to libraries to teach creative writing workshops in those communities. And so, yeah, so the program is starting up again with July 1st events. So I welcome you all to apply, and I'll send you information about that after the meeting. I will also send out a roster and invite you all to join our literary lit list for California. And unless you folks have any other questions, I think we can close out our event for today. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us. It was great to see all your faces, and I hope to hear from you all in the future. Take care and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.